Tonight for dinner, I'm going to be making a Tex-Mex favorite, something that's a little bit hard to find here in Belgium. I'm going to be making nachos. And the very most important ingredient in nachos is the nacho cheese. And so that's what I'm going to start with today. You'll see here all the ingredients before you that you need to make a really nice nacho cheese sauce. We must, of course, start with our milk. Then we've got to have lots and lots of cheese. I have 3 different kinds of cheese here actually. I have some cheddar cheese. I have some cheese called Maredsous cheese. It's an Abbey cheese here. It's white and soft and mild. If you're in the United States, then Monterey Jack or Pepper Jack would do. And then I've also got American cheese. I know it's white for those of you in the United States. You're used to it being yellow. The reason that we add that is because it gives nacho cheese a really smooth texture, a little bit like what we're used to in fast food. I also have here a bowl with an even mix of red bell pepper and onion that's diced really small. I've got some garlic cloves, I have salt, I have cayenne pepper, and I've got cumin. So in just a second, we're going to start cooking up our cheese sauce. So here we see a preheated pan on a little bit lower than medium, and it already has some olive oil heating up because the first thing we're going to do is cook our vegetables. Now, cheese sauce is a really delicate, a really hard to cook thing sometimes because your cheese sauce can curdle, which means it can develop chunks and things like that. The cheese might not melt so well. It can be really gross if we're not super careful. So we'll begin with our vegetables and we're going to saute these until they are soft. We can also add our garlic. Now that our vegetables are nice and soft, we're going to add our milk and turn the heat on our burner way down to almost its lowest setting. We need to do that because the milk needs to be heated, but it should not be too hot. We don't want to burn the cheese when we add that, and we don't want to curdle our cheese sauce. So all I want the milk to do is to get warm. While it's warming up though, we can add our spices. I'm going to be starting with cayenne pepper, and I like spicy nacho sauce. So I'm going to add a half a teaspoon of cayenne pepper. You can also add jalapeno peppers if you chop those up, or the serrano chiles that I've used before in Mexican recipes. You could use, say, 2 or 3 jalapenos, maybe 1 or 2 serrano chiles. I'm going to add a tablespoon of cumin, and I might even add more later. But we all know that Miss Dani loves cumin. So that's a lot of cumin, but I love it. I'm also going to add a little bit of salt. But remember, cheese has salt in it, so we might not need any more than that. I also need to make sure that I have a good whisk. A whisk looks like this, and it's going to help me to evenly mix and melt my cheese. So I'm not going to boil this, I'm just going to let it sit for a minute or 2 so that the milk can get warm enough to melt the cheese when we add it. So with my burner still on a pretty low temperature, I'm going to start adding my cheese. I actually want to add the American cheese last, so I'm just going to take it and set that bit of it aside in my old garlic bowl. I want to add this cheese first, and here's the trick of adding cheese to milk. We want the cheese that we've added to melt before we add more. Otherwise, we overload the sauce. So I'm just going to take, it can be a mix of these two. I'm just going to take like a small handful, and I'm going to sprinkle it into the pot. I could do a little bit more than this. Maybe another handful. Sprinkle that into the pot, and then I'm going to use my whisk to stir until all of that cheese melts. And then I can add more. It's about time to add the rest of our cheddar and white cheese. And after this is melted, next, it'll be the American cheese. And it's about that time we're going to add all of our American cheese. You can just sort of plop it down on in there in chunks. It doesn't really matter if it's like all the little individual slices, but I'm doing it because I'm fancy. Let's see, we could put 2 in, we could put 3 in, and it'd be okay. And now, with constant stirring, we have here a wonderful cheese sauce. I will tell you that whilst we were off camera, I did have to even add a little bit extra of the cheddar cheese just to get the flavor right, but everything else was right on point, and this is going to go great on top of our nachos. For the remainder of our nacho meal, we're not actually going to need that much to prepare it. Most of the things are just other stuff that goes on top of the nachos besides the cheese. We're going to be preparing some Mexican spiced ground beef. It's actually going to have a lot of the same spices that our cheese sauce had in it. Cumin, salt, pepper, paprika, maybe a little bit of cayenne, maybe a little bit of oregano. We've also got here a can of red beans. You can use red beans, you can use black beans. Just whole beans are great on nachos. We're going to end up dicing some tomato. We might dice some onion, but I haven't gotten it out of the pantry yet. And I've also got some green onion here that we're going to dice to put on top. And finally, my favorite hot sauce. So let's get started with the beef. So now we're going to prepare the beef, the ground beef, for our nachos. And what I have prepared is I've got my ground beef here. And I've prepared a special Miss Dani spice mix to go on top of that ground beef. We're going to start, however, with just our ground beef and a little bit of oil. I've already preheated this pan, and a teaspoon maybe of oil. You don't need too much. My ground beef is really lean, so that's really the reason I'm using the oil. If you've got good fatty ground beef, you don't even need the oil. Now we're going to break this up and cook it until it is completely browned, all the way through all the pieces. While our ground beef is heating up, we could be doing one of 2 things. We can be preparing our tomatoes and our green onions, and I've just remembered we could also be heating up our beans. Now what I like to do is I like to pop open the beans, pour the entire can into a small saucepan. That means the liquid that's in here as well. I like to heat the beans in that liquid, and I even like to add a little bit of butter just for some flavor. And then once the beans are heated all the way through, they're just going to be poured right on top of the nachos. So I'm going to take a second, I'm going to put the beans on the stove, and then come back to slice my vegetables. All I'm going to do with my tomato is dice it very small. I don't want to waste any of my tomato though, so I'm going to start with the top. Get rid of this little guy right there. For my onion, if you want to be really fancy, then we can cut this onion on the diagonal. Now first things first, we want to get rid of the bottom, and gently and smoothly we slice diagonally with mom or dad always with us, maybe doing this, maybe showing us how to do it carefully. And then what we get is this really cool little onion that is all pretty and diagonally cut. So once your vegetables are finished, then all you've got to do is make sure that your beef and your beans are getting heated, and it's almost time for nachos. Now there is indeed one last thing that I very nearly forgot. I have preheated my oven to about 120, 110 degrees Celsius. Not very warm at all. Almost just enough to keep something warm. And I've got chips on a baking tray, but Miss Dani, you might be asking, they're already cooked. What are you doing? Believe it or not, guys, if you've never tried a warmed tortilla chip, you are missing out. So, while I'm getting all of my stuff ready for my nachos, I'm going to pop these into the oven for about 10 minutes on a really nice low temperature. Probably even turn down the temperature once I'm done because I don't want to cook my chips. I just want them to be really nice and warm when it's time to serve our nachos. Our ground beef is brown. You can see here our beans are in a pot getting warmer and warmer. It's time now to add the spice mix as well as the water to our recipe. This is maybe 100 milliliters, maybe 150. I just add until things are moist. So we're going to mix this up. And then we're going to let the heat of the pan make the liquid start to bubble a little bit. We're going to simmer the beef until this sauce gets nice and thick. The magic is happening. We have simmering beef, which is absolutely perfect. I am just going to let it sit here on this low temperature for a moment until that thickens up. So I shouldn't need to stir it because it's not going to burn. So if we give this a stir, it's hard to see in the camera, but this has thickened in a really nice way. What you can see is there's no more watery liquid on the bottom of the pan, which means that this should be done. Last but not least, a cook must try her own food before she serves it to people. So I'm going to grab my tasting spoon and make sure the seasonings are right. Oh yes. So that's perfect. If you wanted it a little bit spicier, you could have added maybe a half a teaspoon of cayenne instead of the quarter teaspoon I added. But honestly, I think this is absolutely perfect. So that means that as soon as our beans are warm, it's time to make some nachos. Now it's time to assemble our nachos. I have here my warm chips, and I like to do my nachos in layers. So I'll put down a bed of chips here, and then I'll start piling on. Usually, I begin with some beans, then comes some meat, then our delicious cheese sauce, and now another layer of chips and repeat. And finally, we put whatever it is that we want on top. In this case, I'm going to be using some fresh tomatoes, some of my delicious green onions, perhaps some hot sauce, so here we are, nachos. Enjoy.